Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Republican agendas, constitutional citizenship, and the problem of enforcement. The core question is this: how did Republican leaders divide over restoration, civil rights, and enforcement after slavery ended? The core competency is to contrast the competing agendas of Republican Party leaders after the Civil War. What must victory change in law before emancipation becomes more than a battlefield result? Reconstruction began before the war ended because Union victory forced Republicans to answer a question that battlefield success could not settle by itself. If slavery was ending, what would replace the political and legal order that had defended it? Abraham Lincoln's answer first took the form of wartime restoration. His December 1863 proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction offered a path back into the Union when 10% of a state's 1860 voters swore loyalty and accepted emancipation. The design fit military needs. It encouraged defections from the Confederacy, gave Union commanders something workable in occupied areas, and kept restoration under executive control while the war still moved. The advantages of that policy were real, though its risks were obvious even at the time. 10% was a small threshold in states where white elites still controlled local reputation, county networks, and much of the physical property. A restored government built on that base could renounce secession while preserving older habits of labor control and racial hierarchy. Republicans therefore entered Reconstruction with different agendas because they judged the same facts differently. Some wanted reunion with minimal delay. Others concluded that a defeated planter class would recover local authority quickly unless the national government imposed stronger terms. That difference was a procedural difference before it became a moral one. Whoever set the terms of restoration would also shape labor law, voter access, county courts, and the future meaning of freedom. A presidential approach favored speed and a narrower oath, whereas a congressional approach favored conditions, review, and longer supervision. The fight over Republican agendas was therefore a fight over machinery, and the Constitution that had survived Civil War was now being used by rival branches to test which one would define the post-war order. The Wade-Davis Bill of 1864 made the congressional alternative explicit. It required a majority of white male citizens to swear that they had never voluntarily aided the Confederacy before a state could be restored, and it gave Congress greater power to judge the resulting governments. Benjamin Wade and Henry Winter Davis wanted more than symbolic reunion. They wanted a larger loyalty threshold and a process that would make ex-Confederate recovery slower and more uncertain. Lincoln refused the bill through a pocket veto, preserving executive flexibility and signaling that wartime restoration remained his preferred instrument. Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 changed the argument immediately. Andrew Johnson became president. At the moment, Confederate armies surrendered, and his position combined several traits that made Reconstruction unstable. He was a Southern Unionist, he resented the planter elite, and he rejected black political equality. In May 1865, he appointed provisional governors, called state conventions, and offered pardons broadly enough that many former Confederates soon returned to influence. Wealthy men technically needed special pardons, yet Johnson granted those pardons freely. Restoration sped forward while Congress was out of session, and white Southern elites used the opening quickly. The Black Codes of late 1865 changed the political terrain more than abstract speeches ever could have done. Mississippi required annual labor contracts and punished vagrancy in ways that threatened forced work. South Carolina restricted occupations and taxed work outside approved categories. Apprenticeship rules gave white officials leverage over black children. These statutes did not recreate slavery in legal form, though they plainly aimed to organize black labor and movement under close white control. Republican disagreement now had a visible record. Lenient restoration had produced state governments willing to narrow freedom through ordinary legislation. Northern readers encountered this shift through testimony, reports, and newspaper accounts. Bureau agents described wage theft, coerced contracts, and judges unwilling to hear black testimony. Army officers reported local violence and intimidation. Congressional Republicans returning to Washington in December 1865 saw more than a theoretical danger. They saw restored Southern legislatures moving rapidly to define freedom on white terms. The alternative to stronger federal intervention no longer had to be imagined. It had already been tried in practice. The Joint Committee on Reconstruction translated that evidence into legislative strategy. Members gathered testimony from Army officers, Bureau agents, Southern Unionists, and Black witnesses, and they treated that record as proof that the old state-centered settlement could not be trusted. Reports from Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina repeated the same pattern. White local authority had accepted defeat in war while resisting social and political equality and peace. Committee work therefore gave congressional Republicans a documentary basis for acting against the president rather than relying on partisan instinct alone. The Freedmen's Bureau became the most visible federal instrument in this phase of Reconstruction. Created in March 1865 as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, it operated inside the War Department under Commissioner Oliver O. Howard. Bureau officers handled rations, medical aid, labor contracts, schools, family reunification requests, and some legal disputes. One officer in a district might inspect a schoolhouse, review a plantation contract, and record evidence of violence in the same week. The Bureau therefore linked daily survival to larger constitutional questions. It was not a side agency. It was federal governance at close range in counties where former slaveholders still held social and economic power. Congressional Republicans used Bureau evidence to build their case against Johnson's restoration. Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, Lyman Trumbull, John Bingham, and others did not represent a single mind, though they agreed that local white authority in the former Confederacy could not be trusted to secure fair civil status for freed people. The Bureau showed why. Contracts often favored employers sharply, planters pressured laborers through debt and access to supplies, and local courts rarely worked as neutral guardians. A republic that had destroyed slavery by war now had to decide whether peacetime federal authority would defend the people the war had freed. Johnson resisted that direction repeatedly. In February 1866, he vetoed a Bureau extension bill claiming peacetime federal supervision of Southern society violated constitutional limits and favored one class of people. Congress lacked the votes to override that first measure, though the political damage to Johnson grew. Riots in Memphis and New Orleans during 1866 further undermined his position because white mobs and officials attacked black citizens and their allies in moments that exposed the weakness of local protection. Congress then revised the Bureau legislation and passed it again in July 1866. This time it overrode Johnson's veto. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 marked the same transition from restoration to enforcement. It declared all persons born in the United States citizens, except most Native people still treated outside taxed citizenship, and it guaranteed civil rights in contracts, property, and access to courts regardless of race. Johnson vetoed that act as well. Congress overrode him in April 1866, and the override changed the institution. It showed that the legislative branch would define post-war civil status over presidential resistance, when enough Republicans concluded that local white government had become the main danger to freedom. Events in Memphis and New Orleans deepened that conclusion. In Memphis, during May 1866, white policemen and mobs killed dozens of black residents, burned homes, schools, and churches, and demonstrated how weak local protection remained even after emancipation. In New Orleans during July, violence around a reconvened constitutional convention killed or wounded many delegates and supporters seeking a broader suffrage settlement. These episodes entered congressional debate as evidence that civil status could not be left to local good sense. The danger was visible in body counts, burned buildings, and sworn testimony. Republicans still feared that a statute might be repealed later or narrowed by hostile courts, so they moved toward constitutional change. The Joint Committee on Reconstruction gathered testimony, reviewed Southern violence, and concluded that national citizenship had to be written into the Constitution itself. The resulting 14th Amendment answered several problems at once. It overturned the logic of Dred Scott by declaring that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. It limited state action through due process and equal protection. It penalized states that denied the vote to adult male citizens by reducing representation. It barred many former Confederates from office and rejected Confederate debt. The amendment's language shows how far Reconstruction had moved since 1863. Lincoln's 10% plan assumed restored state governments might resume normal constitutional life with modest conditions. The 14th Amendment assumed states themselves could become engines of rights denial unless national citizenship stood above them. The phrase, all persons born or naturalized in the United States, was a direct answer to state efforts to treat black people as laborers, without full political membership. The command, no state shall, made the point even sharper. Federal victory had produced a new theory of citizenship. States could no longer be left alone to define who counted and what legal protection attached to that status. Section 2 also preserved the limits inside Republican agreement. The amendment did not establish women's suffrage, and Section 2 referred specifically to male citizens in its representation formula. Moderates accepted that compromise to hold a broad enough coalition together, while radicals treated the amendment as a large step that still left serious work unfinished. It nationalized citizenship without solving every dispute over participation, protection, and enforcement. The text was therefore both expansive and cautious, revolutionary in one direction and restrained in another. Southern rejection of the amendment gave Congress its next answer. Former Confederate legislatures largely refused ratification in 1866, which confirmed that Johnson's Restoration governments would not willingly accept a deeper civil rights settlement. The amendment thus became a pivot point between two phases of Reconstruction. It ended one period of argument over civil status and opened another period of readmission. Under military supervision, new constitutions, black male suffrage, and a longer confrontation between Congress and the executive branch. The text also carried a representational weapon in Section 2, which threatened reduced congressional representation for states that denied the vote to adult male citizens. That clause did not guarantee suffrage by itself, though it showed that Republicans were linking political participation to national power calculations. A state that wanted restored representation in Congress would have to confront the cost of excluding black men from the electorate. The amendment was therefore a citizenship settlement and a bargaining instrument at the same time. By the end of 1866, Republican agendas had been clarified by events. Lincoln's restoration model had emphasized war needs, flexibility, and a small loyalty threshold. Johnson's policies accelerated white Southern political recovery and produced the Black Codes. Congressional Republicans responded with Bureau renewal, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and the 14th Amendment. Their answer did not arise from philosophical abstraction alone. It arose from reports, riots, statutes, and county-level evidence showing how rapidly freedom could be narrowed if federal power retreated. These victories still left major gaps. Land redistribution never became a broad national policy, so freed people entered legal freedom without the economic base many had hoped for. The Bureau could mediate contracts and support schools, though it had limited staff and uneven capacity. The 14th Amendment promised national citizenship, yet courts, appropriations, and elections would determine how much force that promise carried. Republicans had won the argument for stronger federal action in 1866, but they had not settled how long the country would sustain that action or how far it would go in remaking local power. The consequence was a Reconstruction state stronger than anything antebellum Americans had usually accepted and still weaker than what the task required. Congress had overridden a president, nationalized citizenship, and recognized that rights demanded administration as well as rhetoric. At the same time, Southern resistance persisted, Northern fatigue remained possible, and every gain depended on continued enforcement. The next phase would show what happened when Congress tried to convert those principles into readmission terms, military oversight, voter registration, and constitutional politics on the ground. Several names help anchor that transition. Stevens pressed for stronger remaking of Southern society. Bingham supplied major constitutional language. Howard defended the amendment in the Senate, and Trumbull worked through statutory civil rights. None of them solved the problem alone. Together, they show that congressional reconstruction rested on committees, speeches, draft language, veto overrides, and the slow conversion of field evidence into national law. Republican agendas were never abstractions floating above events. They were institutional answers to the record created by war's end. Congressional reconstruction converted battlefield evidence into statutes, amendments, bureau expansion, and new definitions of citizenship. The harder judgment is whether legal redesign could ever hold if land, local violence, and political resistance remained largely in hostile hands. Law moved first because war had to end, but law alone could not guarantee what the new citizenship would survive.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.